training, consulting, and staff augmentation. Connect with us online or chat with myself or Jesse. We'd love to get to know you and what you're doing with Angular. We have a code of conduct for our Rocky Mountain Angular Meetup. Go ahead and I'll give everybody a couple minutes to read through that. Okay, everybody done? All right, good. Yes. Excellent, thank you, Reed. Let's go ahead and get, I think we just have one announcement for right now in terms of upcoming meetups. Jesse, CEO for Prebug, is going to be presenting on I'm Not Ready for NGRX. He just did this up in Boulder about a month ago, a couple of weeks ago. Went really well. I would definitely encourage you to come on out and check that out. Basically going to talk a little bit about using singletons as services and behavior subjects. So kind of like a subject with a service kind of talk. So that's really exciting. So that'll be downtown at Legwork Studio, or I guess that's in Rhino technically. And that'll be Thursday, October 11th. So come out and join us. It'll be a lot of fun. We're always looking for people to present. So shoot us an email at meetups@prebug.com if you're interested. I always kind of say this, don't feel like it needs to be some super high level nerdy talk, right? Talk about something you're passionate about, something you're doing at work. Just share with us in the community about what you're doing. We'd be really interested in hearing it. Just shoot us an email, give us basically a quick description and maybe like a title or something like that, okay? I'll go ahead and open it up. Anybody looking for work? No, everybody is happily employed. Awesome, excellent. Anybody looking for developers? Yeah, go ahead, James in the back.
We are hiring a charter. We need a senior lead for Angular, so if you're interested, let me know.
Okay, so senior lead at charter. Is that down in the DTC?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that would be on site?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So talk to Jamie if you're, James, if you're interested. Is it Jamie? James? I don't know. Now I'm like, talk to Spivey afterwards. He'll help you out. Very cool. I don't think we have any housekeeping. There's drinks in the fridge if you need. Bathrooms are out and to your right. Okay, let's go ahead and get into a couple of announcements. I like to do this every month. I've been doing like a what's new with Angular. Just to kind of, in case you guys haven't been on Twitter every day or following everything, just a couple of quick things that I've been kind of watching the last month or so in the Angular community. The first one, and we blogged about this, so you can check it out on blog.prebug.com, and it'll kind of go into some of the details on each one of these. But let's go ahead and start the Angular console beta release. Anybody check out the Angular console? Awesome. Anybody want to kind of give us a quick rundown on what it is that's checked it out?
It had all kinds of problems with dependencies.
It had all kinds of problems with dependencies? Oh, that's unfortunate. It
Well,
is beta.
It is, sure.
Okay.
But it's pretty cool. It's,
Yeah.
You don't have to memorize all the switches.
There you go. So the Angular console it's basically a GUI wrapper around the CLI. It does a couple of really nice things when it comes to dealing with workspace. Certainly exposes you to all the options and all the arguments that go into the CLI that you may not be aware of, and helps you that way. So certainly check that out. Released by the Narwhal folks, so that's pretty cool. We also had native script schematics get released this month. So that's a really great collection of schematics if you're doing anything with native script to help you gen out native script projects and native script pages and all these kinds of things. And then Jest testing scenarios. Anybody using Jest? Got a couple of people using Jest. Testing scenarios is pretty cool. They just came out with this. Allows you to roll up what might be a bunch of tests that are very similar, and you can kind of describe scenarios and put them all together into one test. So allows you to do some pretty neat things with Jest. So check that out. And then the last thing is NGX Kit. NGX Kit is a component library or a component library build tool that enables you to build component libraries, something like maybe not on the scale of Angular material, but think of like a component library like that. It allows you to easily build one yourself and kind of go beyond just theming it like you could with Angular material. So that's pretty cool as well. So check those all out in your free time and have fun with that. We are live streaming on YouTube. Everybody say hi. That was really lame. Great. If you want a t-shirt or a water bottle, we've got them. So ask our speaker a question and he might throw one at you or hand one to you. And that's it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome up David East from Google, who's going to be talking about performant font stuff.
Yeah, there you go.
Good. Round of applause.
All right, so like I said, my name is David East. I'm a developer advocate at Google. I work on Firebase. Most of the time I get up and I just do lots and lots of Firebase presentations. But tonight I'm going to do something that I'm passionate about, and that is fonts. And so I'm actually very strangely obsessed with fonts. So if you've ever like deep dived on a subject and then you found sort of like another subject inside of that subject, and then you get really deep on that subject, like if the top level subject is web development, the amount of time I've spent just learning about fonts is just kind of bizarre. And I like fonts not just and from a web development perspective, like I go to font websites, I look at different types of fonts, I play kerning games, and I'm like, oh, that one's kind of like, and I kind of just look at all these different families of fonts, and it's like this weird passion of mine. But when it comes to web development, I'm also really kind of intrigued about what it takes to load a web font. Because we've all loaded web fonts before, and at a basic level, it's not very difficult. But when you really look to see what it takes to do it at a very performant level, it's actually really difficult. And fonts aren't something that engineers tend to really care about. They kind of see it as that's a designer's job. It's sort of an artist. You imagine someone with a big calligraphy pen, just and some little crazy ruler that we don't know the name of, and that's who does fonts. And we just see them as art. And the thing about fonts, though, is that they're actually very powerful. They affect the perception of which you see something. So I want you to take just a couple seconds. I want you to look at this font. You can read through it, look at the style of it, and I want you to kind of get a good feel for it. Just kind of drink it in. That's a pretty good drink. And now I want you to think about this font you saw. Just think about one word, just something it made you think of, something it made you feel, or something that you would use to describe it. Now, have you look at it again, just so you feel like you could get a really good word for it.
Robin Hood. Maybe that's something for Fox. I don't know.
All right. Robin Hood.
I'll go with that.
Robin dash Hood, one word. All right. Anyone else? Any takers of what that made you feel? Germain? German. Oh, that's. Oh. All right. Anyone? All right. Calligraphy. Storybook. All right. So the words I used: old, historic, German, important. Feels like someone someone really knows what they're doing if they're writing in that font. And this is actually called Blackletter. It's a whole family of fonts that all derives from Johannes Gutenberg, because it was one of the very first, if not the first family of fonts ever used in print. And so if you want to affect the perception of something, if you really want to use this font to kind of give someone this emotion or this perception of a product, what would you use it on? Beer. So German beer uses this at a crazy level. So there's one German beer with Blackletter. There's another one that's kind of like a fancier Blackletter. You kind of look at this one and you're like, wow, this is kind of like the German beer I like, but it's a little curvier, so I think it's fancier. So that's definitely what this is going to taste like. And then there's also this one, which is literally called Old German Beer, which could have been the 3 words I used to describe Blackletter font. And another thing about fonts is that they also do quite well at capturing your attention. So if you look at this right here, you can think of more words that describe this kind of font. So I look at this, I kind of see thick, loud, it's very noisy. And these fonts are called slab fonts. And they didn't just someone said, oh, I just want a big font, that sounds good. the way Slab Fonts came about is that in the 1800s, in order for anyone to see your advertising or your stores, you had to have huge fonts. If we had these skinny sans serif fonts, you wouldn't see anything as you're walking down through the town center. And just for fun fact, this is New York City in the 1800s. And so when we think about fonts as art because they're pretty or because they take up space or whatever they do, that's not exactly true, because fonts are also tools. With fonts, I can invoke an emotion from someone. I can create a desired perception. I can attract attention. And if I use them properly, fonts can become a part of my brand. And the examples of how you can use fonts for different families, different use cases are just endless. And if you want to learn more about this side of fonts, this is a book that I just highly recommend. Doesn't matter really what you do for a living. You can learn so much by reading this, called Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. It is just phenomenal. Every time I read through this book, it's just like another thing I didn't realize that I learned. So it's really, really good. But I'm not here to talk about just sort of the stylistic parts of font. I'm really here today to talk about how fonts apply to the web. It's important to know why we want to use fonts, but we kind of have to see how the heck we actually get them into our apps. So in the beginning, we had sites like AngularFire. I may look young, but I used the heck out of AngularFire back in the day. GeoCities, Yahoo Pages, or using Front Page. And these are all the kind of things we use to build apps. But this toolbox was really empty. We had like Arial and Courier and Papyrus and our favorite Comic Sans. And there wasn't really all that much we could do to, draw attention, or at least, in a bad way with Comic Sans, or like change someone's perception. And this is actually my current personal blog, kind of like a nice, mid-90s site. And if you want to do this yourself, it's one of my favorite websites ever, called GeoCitiesizer. You just paste in any link, and it will literally turn it into a GeoCities site. Just anyone at all. It's fantastic. This site's been up for like 10 years. So I'm shocked every time I go to it. It still works. But eventually, we got away from that, and we got font face. And the font face rule is how we could bring our own fonts from anywhere out in the world to the web. And then in 2011, something very big happened for web fonts. Probably the biggest thing that has ever happened and probably ever will happen. And that is Google Fonts. Google Fonts was phenomenal because I could go through, I could search and discover fonts. I could go into the search bar and find all these different versions of Garamond and try them out, compare them with others. It was just like a massive leap for using web fonts. It was discoverable, comparable, but most importantly, it was consumable. It gave us a way to take fonts from that site and put them into our own app. And it was really just made everything much more simple. But what we may not know is that it made it more tough for performance. So this is usually what we see when we start clicking through and we select our fonts. In this case, I have 5 families selected. And the amazing thing is to get this into my app, all I have to do is copy this style sheet, throw it in my index.html, type some styles, and that's it. And I have web fonts. And that's kind of phenomenal when you think about that. But it does come at a cost. Is that you see the load time there is slow. Now I'm using 5 fonts. And then you must be thinking, oh, it's slow because you're using 5 fonts. And that's kind of how Google Fonts calculates it. But that's not true, actually. The fact that I have 5 fonts up there doesn't really make it slow. Just one font makes it slow. I can use 100 fonts, and it's really about the same. And so because what happens is, down in the code, is that style sheet kind of links to a bunch of these different font face rules, where I say the font family name is Bevan, its style is normal, it has a 400 weight, which also means normal. The local rule is also something really cool that I discovered by just kind of looking through this. That means if this is locally available on the user's computer, it will load that first. But that also means that if it is locally available on your computer and you're trying to do performance testing on it, it will load instantly and you cannot prove that it runs slow. So that was a infuriating hour I never got back. But it is it's a really cool rule. But what's really important here is the URL, because this is the source file. This is what the actual font is. And anytime you see a URL or something like this in the browser, what happens? Exactly. HTTP request. That one for the camera. Yeah, exactly. It has to make an HTTP request. And what happens when an HTTP request happens? You wait. So what's going to happen to my web page as this fonts load? Let's have a quiz. Will it A, the page won't load until the fonts load? Will it B, a fallback font will be used instead? C, the text will be invisible? Or D, is the web, so like all one of them, or all three, or I don't really know what's going to happen. There's like 7 browsers I have to support. So the answer is D. So let's kind of figure this out. Let's hold an experiment. So I created this site. For me, while I love web fonts, and it is one of my strange passions, another strange passion of mine are news sites, because news sites are very interesting. As the web grows and grows and grows, content grows, and that's what we really want. We want our content now, and we want our content free. And for news sites, they're like, well, we gotta get money off you somehow, and you're not gonna pay for our content, so we're gonna like serve you up tons of ads, and ads make things slower. And so it's these crazy like opposing business interests and user interests, like I need it fast, but I need to make money. So I find that to be really interesting. So I decided to create a sort of pseudo news site for this. And I chose a bunch of fonts. I used Bevan because it's a really nice headlining font. It's thick. It has really like well-defined serifs. It kind of just feels like a nice, title font. And then I use Sinsol Decorative for my logo font because it's very like whimsical and very friendly. And it's like, oh, that feels very important because it's got little flaring serifs. And I used, can't pronounce this one. That's a good font. It's a really nice subtitle font. It's prominent enough, it's thick enough, but it's still kind of friendly. And it doesn't take away attention from the main font. And then for sort of like my brand or my logo font, or to do like categories, use Oswald. It's like, kind of gets the job done. It's thick, but it's not doesn't take too much attention. And then for my text, I use E.B. Garamond, which is the only kind of Garamond is like a very famous font from a very famous, one of the first like people to go out there and make fonts way, way back in the day. And so Garamond is used quite heavily in books and in news sites and everything. It's very easy and something our eyes are used to for long form. So I picked these 5 fonts. I have 5 good reasons for them. Can I load them quickly? So I went to my favorite website in the entire world, which is webpagetest.org. If you've never been there, it's the best free way to profile any site's performance. And this is sort of what I got. So we're gonna kind of wait. We're waiting. Okay, oh, that doesn't look like anything. Okay, all right, there we go. So it took about 7 seconds or so just to see any text on the page. And this was done on a 3G connection, on a phone. And like, how did that make you feel, like waiting there for that long? And I wasn't even putting any ads on there or tracking scripts or anything that you'd see on news sites. That was just pure, there was pretty much no JavaScript at all. And so when things take that long, it makes it feel slow, makes your product feel inferior or unreliable even, and it leaves your user feeling frustrated. And so you're trying to use fonts to shape your brand, to create a perception, to invoke emotion. But really all you've done is you made your brand just feel like slow is a part of your brand. Oh, smack the dongle. Stop it. Stop it. It's like a very timely spot to do that in. All right. So let's take a look at why this is happening. So this is the film strip view in web page test. And we can see that the font load happens right around here, around 7.5 to 8 seconds. So it's pretty much that much time it takes for a user to see anything of significance on your page. So let's zoom in a little more. And so down here at the bottom, this is where kind of like the gold is. Like if we look kind of down here, we can see this is index.html. It took almost 2 seconds. There's a lot of latency on mobile networks. So it took about 2 seconds for that to happen. And then after the document is downloaded, the fonts are then discovered. So it has to discover the CSS. And what's interesting is you see these 3 bars right here. Well, that's a different domain. So I have to do the DNS, I have to do the connect, to get the SSL handshake, I have to do that whole TCP round trip for an entirely different domain. And that's just to get the style sheets. And what do the style sheets contain? Links out to the actual fonts. So that's basically 3 network requests before I can begin, or 2 network requests before I can begin to do the 3rd and most important network request to get the font. And we can see right here, right around 7.5 seconds, some of the fonts start to load, some load a little faster because there's multiple ones. But that right there is why it took that long. What's crazy is that you can see that at about 1973 milliseconds, so about 2 seconds, all my HTML, my CSS for my site was inlined or embedded in. So I could actually load. It's on a lower phone, it might take to 2.5 seconds or something like that. But I could load at 2.5 seconds. But I can't because the way my web fonts are set up. So it's actually taking till about 8. And if we zoom in, you can see that we kind of have nothing for 2.5 seconds, and then we get something. And there's actually a term for this. It's called FOIT. It's a flash of invisible text. And so the way that this works is, this is different from browser to browser, but sort of the standard is that when the browser is waiting for your web fonts to download, it's going to give it a good old college try while it waits. And it's going to wait for about 3 seconds or so. And on a slow mobile network, it will be 3 seconds or more. So this will happen. And then what's going to happen is after 3 seconds, the browser says, fine, I'm just going to go back to the other font and load something. Then once that font loads, it goes and then it swaps. And that's an okay way of doing things, but as you saw, I could have loaded everything in about 2.5 seconds, and it took me to about 7.5, 8 seconds. So FOIT is kind of like, hey, at least the page isn't blank. That's a better than nothing approach. So how do we go, Google Fonts makes this easy, but how do I get past this performance benefit? How do I get away from this FOIT? Well, I'm going to start with the most easy way you can actually do this. And there's a new-ish CSS property called font display. And so if you have a font rule, the font family being Bevan, all that stuff, you can see that there's a new thing we've added called font display, and we've used a value of swap. And with that one line, it gives me a whole lot more control and a way better performance line. And then also, I can use multiple different values. I can use auto, which would just give me the default behavior, which is everything we were doing before. I use swap, where it will render the first fallback font, and then will swap automatically when it's downloaded. I could use block, which is way worse than auto. It will just literally block until it's downloaded, so I don't use that one ever. There's fallback, where the browser is going to wait for about 100 milliseconds, then it uses the fallback. So it kind of says like, hey, kind of waits like, hey, is this going to be good? No? Okay, all right, let's load the other one. And then there's optional, where the browser, this one's kind of tricky because it's up to the browser. It's not 100 milliseconds. I think Chrome does in about 300 milliseconds, but it's a little not deterministic because maybe Edge is like 700 milliseconds and Firefox is like 3 seconds. And then, you don't know what it's going to be, but in this case, it kind of waits for a little bit and then it falls back. So the browser kind of says, hey, just trust this. We know what we're doing. And so it's a lot of values. And so we kind of wonder, like, which one should I use? I prefer using swap because there's some tricks, which I'll show you here in a little bit you can do with it. But honestly, you kind of go with what the aesthetic or what the point of your site is and just kind of play around with them and see which one works best. And so when I switch to swap, we can see that In about 3 seconds, I got the fallback font. And then the font loaded in about 6. So this is much, much faster than what I had before. It shaved 5 whole seconds off what I was showing people before. And so the user is able to read content, interact with it. It's what I wanted. And 5 seconds on a slow network is really, really good. But anytime you just write one line of code and it does a bunch of stuff, there's just always a catch. You're not like, wow, I wrote one line of code, everything's better. Better collect my paycheck and go home now. That's just not how it works. And that's because if we look at the support for font display, does not work in IE11, does not work in any version of Edge, and it's currently not being worked on in Edge at all. So if there's just like one thing you do coming to this talk, you get 3 maximum votes on any Edge issue. Just go to bit.ly/font-vote, and we can say we want this thing, and then they'll actually work on it because they're currently not working on it. So you just tell Edge people this is very important, makes the web faster and easier. But since we can't really use that in sites that use Edge, which is a massive amount of users, or IE, like what do? Do we just go back to FOIT? Oh, no. We use our good old friend JavaScript. So this is the game plan that we have devised. One, we're actually going to use the fallback font as the primary font, which is kind of weird because it's not really the primary one, but we're going to list it first, but it's the fallback. It's kind of weird. You'll see it in a second. And then we're going to load a custom font with JavaScript. And then once it's loaded, we're going to swap the font classes, or swap the fonts using CSS classes. And then to make sure that any repeat users don't have to do this wait, load, and swapping, we're going to cache some variable in session storage and just say, hey, don't worry about it. Just use the already loaded font. So this part's super easy. On my body, I'm just going to say, hey, my font's Arial. I could get more specific with this if I want, but this is your most base way of doing it. And then I need to load with JavaScript. So there's actually a library for this called Font Face Observer. It's really, really light. It makes you bring your own promise library in, but all together you can just do it for a few kilobytes, which is really nice. And then once you have it loaded, you can load fonts individually. So in this case, I'll say new Font Face Observer of Bevan. I want to load the one with weight 400. And then once I have this, I'm going to say load. This function basically says wait up to 10,000 seconds, or sorry, 10,000 milliseconds, or 10 seconds. After that, it just fails, and we're just giving up. And then once it's loaded, I'm just going to grab the body, and I'm just going to add the class list of Bevan loaded. And so my Bevan loaded class just sets the font family to Bevan. And so it swaps, just like that. And then right here, for caching with session storage, I'll just use session storage, and I'll check to see if the fonts are loaded as true and add Bevan. And then if not, then I'll just do that load I did before. And once it's loaded, I set that variable to true. So any subsequent request just kind of goes out and loads the font immediately, or renders the font immediately. And we're done. All right. Actually, not really, because there's another crazy term. So basically everything when you're learning font terms, it's all like FOIT, FOFT, FOUT. There's like lots of crazy terms. And so this one that we're currently having the problem with is FOIT, which is a flash of unstyled text. We can see right here we have this really weird font. It's kind of cursive. It's actually cursive font. And then it gets kind of bolder and bigger, and they don't look anything like each other. And if you're reading the website and then all of a sudden it changes, you're like, whoa, it's like kind of a jarring experience for the user. And it goes everything against what we talked about, creating a perception, invoking an emotion. It doesn't really help us there at all. So a site that handles this really, really, really well is the New York Times. So keeping on our theme of content sites. And so content sites are really kind of the place to look at when you want to see how fonts are loaded or fonts are used, because not only do they have to do it quickly, but they care a whole lot about fonts. So New York Times has created 2 versions of their own fonts, which is derivative of a font called Cheltenham. They have 2 different versions of that. The Washington Post has a font called Pistone, which is a derivative of Bodoni, which is another early big font person. And then the Denver Post actually just uses Open Sans from Google Fonts and does it the exact bad way I said in the beginning and doesn't care. But maybe one day. And so what we want to do is we want to match fonts. So to the left here, we have a New York Times article that has the fallback font. And then to the right, it's their custom font. And as we can see, that's pretty good. Like that doesn't look all that different. We have a little bit of difference with the lines, the withouts on the top versus the right. But if we look at the subparagraph, that is almost spot on. And it's really, really nice. And we can even look and watch it in action. So this is kind of sped up. And so it's loading, and this is all just system available fonts. And then boom, at the end, it loads to that. And it's not really that jarring of an experience. I wish I could do that black and white thing at the end. If I could extend it a little more, because you'd see that it's just very subtle. And if you're just flipping through, you won't even notice. So how do we do that? How do we take one locally available font, and how do we match that up with some custom font? Like that seems like a very tall order, because it is. But there's a tool out there by one of my colleagues at Google. She is an engineer on Chrome. She is phenomenal, Monica DiColescu. She created this tool called called Font Style Matcher. In this case, I can use EB Garamond, and I can start messing with line height, font size. I can check to see if it's, how they match up, turn one red, turn one black. I can then set the flash of unstyled text so I can see what happens when it changes. And then when it's all done, I just click a button and I copy those styles. And so my default will be a font family of Georgia with a font size 15 pixels. You end up doing some weird things like having a word spacing of negative 0.7 pixels. And usually when you see stuff like this in CSS, you're like, whoa, that's a code smell, shouldn't be doing that. But in this case, it's okay. Let yourself be really weird and awkward with your CSS numbers, because there's a method behind that madness. And then when the font is loaded, so like inside of the font face observer loaded, I can then say, all right, we're going to load EB Garamond, but we're going to use these different styles. And if I match it up just right, it's just going to be this nice subtle transition. And so when I switch now, wait for the page to load, and then all of a sudden, and that was me not trying very hard. I did that, probably like, I don't know, 2 minutes or so of dragging around. If I wanted to be more meticulous, I could make it way more spot on. I could have looked at different fonts of Georgia or whatever is available on the system, and I could come up with something that was really, really subtle. But even just 1 minute of fidgeting with those sliders gave me a way better experience for my user than just what I was doing before. So this talk is called, Performant font loading for Angular developers, but nothing here has been with Angular. And so you might be thinking, well, how does this apply to me as an Angular developer? Well, imagine if you were out on NPM and you found this NGX font loader module, or you decided to go create one yourself. You'd include your browser module, of course. And then you would say font loader module.for root, and then I want Bevan and EB Garamond, and then it would go and load it for you. And that seems fantastic. It's very simple, and it does a lot of that crazy work behind the scenes for me. But you should never do this, ever. If you see something like this, just don't use it. You don't have to be mean to someone and be like, hey, this shouldn't exist. Don't do that. You don't do this. Just don't use it. Just walk away. Because font loading should be separate from your Angular app. So let's say this is sort of a bundle, our JavaScript bundle, one continuous bundle. Our fonts represent 5% of it, maybe probably less. That probably should be really more like 1 or 2%. And our Angular app is 95 or 97% more. But it's still one entire bundle. And what would happen here on when the user is loading your site, it will have to download this entire JavaScript bundle. It will have to parse through it, and then will then have to execute to the point where it then begins initiating for these font requests. So you are nowhere better than you were before when you first started. And so your fonts shouldn't have to wait for your Angular app to load. You can do that immediately. You want that to be in a separate part. So I can have a really small fonts bundle that's about 1.5 kilobytes, and then my Angular app just kind of lives off of them by itself. So by the time my Angular app loads, those fonts have been like ready and waiting. And so they should be just completely separate. Those parallel work, basically. And so you might be wondering, like, oh no, I gotta split out my app into 2 separate bundles. It's gonna require some like Webpack code splitting, configging, some crazy, you know, Angular CLI.json like config. No, you just like, you know, put your font styles in there and then just create like a script that loads it, you know, script tags, and just put it in your index.html in your Angular app. And that's it. So when you're using web fonts, there's a lot more that we can do. There's things called subsetting, which is using a lesser amount, like kind of stripping characters out. There's FOIT, which is a flash of faux text, which is basically loading only a very the Roman variant of the font, not the bold or the italic, and getting the browser to fake the italic or bold while it loads. You can go way off the deep end here and get really, really advanced. The flash of unstyled content matching is sort of like a very easy, nice performant win compared to some of the other things you can do that are a little crazier. But if you're gonna like kind of boil down, how do I get better at fonts? First off is just avoid that plain old font base. Don't just go to Google Fonts and think you're gonna include that style sheet and everything's gonna be fine. You can do that, but just know, you know, it's gonna be slower. And if you wanna be faster, you know, you saw what we did earlier. And then also, if you're building content sites, you really would rather have the flash of unstyled text to the flash of invisible text, because at least if you can get that matching really well, then you're not they're not just looking at the skeleton of your app. Because if you're a content site, a blog, or a news site, they want to see the words immediately. If they don't see the words, they're like, why am I here? And to beat the or to have to do the flash of unstyled text, you use Font Face Observer. Match styles for a nice subtle transition. Make sure that your font loading is separate from your Angular app. And then also sort of like some not very light homework. There's Zach Leatherman has this just absolutely phenomenal. It is the standard for all types of font loading strategies, called A Comprehensive Guide to Font Loading Strategies, where it details what's good about this strategy, what's bad about this strategy, how it ranks against other strategies, and then has its own code samples with it. It's just, most of the stuff I've learned has been from messing around from that resource. So it's really, really great. So the next time you look at a font, don't think like, oh, that's just some artsy thing. Know that that's a tool. That's something you can use to better your brand, to make a user perceive something in a different way. But just make sure that if you're going to use these tools, you're going to have to load them performantly, or you're going to defeat the whole purpose of doing that in the first place. Also, I write a newsletter for web development. I do stuff like this. Actually, this is literally an edition I had. The very first one I did, called Front End News, just about every 2 weeks or so. I send out something like this. So if you're interested in receiving more information like this, just check that out and subscribe. And that is all. Thank you all so much for coming out. If you have any questions, I'll throw a t-shirt at you.
What is the deferred keyword?
Yes, that is my favorite keyword, or my favorite attribute of all HTML attributes. So basically what it says is that it gives the browser permission to load, or to basically parse and render the entire HTML script first before going into that font file, or into that script file and starting to execute that. So if it wasn't deferred, it would block and do that immediately. And then there's also, you would see async. Async is similar, but it's not as, doesn't go as far. So async basically says, you know, don't run this one immediately. Wait for it to load, but once it's loading, then do it, even if this page hasn't fully rendered yet. So I like defer for things that like in this case, this font loading, if I block on it, it's just going to take longer it's going to make that network request, it's going to wait for that, it's going to parse execute it. So it's going to take longer for this page to load if I don't defer it. This actually isn't all too different than just putting it down at the bottom below, at the very bottom. I just, you know, it's 2018. I'm going to use my fancy keywords. Any other questions?
I had a few questions. One of them is, I don't know if this is even a thing or not, but if you had the unstyled text first, and then you finally get your loaded font to come in, could it possibly have styled something and then it doesn't pop back to the style that you did it?
With CSS rules, it tends to be pretty good. Like it will take that other rule. What I've tried to get too clever and tried to actually use the CSS style sheets like JavaScript API to like write over those, because it's way more performant to do it that way than changing the class. So it's if you have a lot. I had that problem because I had a bunch of individual styles of changing fonts. So instead of updating like 100 classes, which potentially be like thousands of classes, I tried to update the style, which is just like swaps it out super fast, swaps the styles out super fast. That's where you run into the difficulty of where you might say, oh, now it has this font family, but all the other lingering attributes still exist. So you have to like clear it out and do stuff. But with CSS styles, it's with pure CSS, it's pretty easy. And so doing that whole body trick works really well when you have very clearly defined areas and very few areas of text you have to swap out. But when you get very granular with your rules, like you have a class that was like Bevan font class and you had like 100 of them, then or 1,000 of them, then you might want to look into doing it a different way.
Another question. Can you as a developer, is there a way to store a font on the user's device so that the next time
Yes. Yeah. So that's basically just the caching headers that you would put. Just caching. You just cache that asset just as you would any other asset. So you basically, if it was from your own server, you could set like you could set a super long time of caching. So it just when it gets loaded, it stays there. There's lots of different ways to do that. But since it's just an HTTP request for that, the caching headers are the way to go.
I have an interesting question. So Google has the Google fonts,
Mhm.
and they have licensed all these fonts. Why don't they just ship all those fonts in Chrome? It's a stupid question.
Next question.
I mean, it's
Not
legit. No, kind of, no.
I asked them to put Firebase in the browser. And I
Is
didn't
it never
there,
that one
so-
too? Okay. I'll put that pull request.
Yeah.
So there are any other limitations when we talk about cross-browser functionality? I know we probably get pretty decent support, obviously, with Chrome, Firefox,
Safari.
Safari.
Yeah.
What's your experience like when attempting to do this with IE, maybe even older versions and up to Edge? Like, is there any other additional gotchas that you haven't really talked about yet?
Yeah, so like the font renderings, that's actually like what the font, you've probably seen it before, like if you're on a Windows machine and a Mac or a Linux machine, and the font, even though it's the same exact font, it looks different across like all three. And it might even look across different browsers, like IE on one versus the other. So when I'm trying to do that nice, fidgeting with the sliders, you have to accept that you will not be perfect. Like if you try to make sure you can somehow find some golden, like a ratio between all the three where it just fits in perfectly, you're not going to find that. So as long as, you're not going to get to use font display today on Edge at all. But as far as trying to do that subtle matching, you're going to have to accept some not perfect. You just want it to be good, but and want it to be great, and you're like, 90% of my users use Firefox, so let me make sure it works phenomenal in Firefox. But yeah, it's just not going to be perfect everywhere.
font matching tool that you showed us, is that available?
Oh yeah. That's just Google font style matcher is the very first thing that pops up.
I have a generic Google Fonts question. This question, some of those fonts, I assume Google acquired somehow or licensed. Did they create any of their own
probably like, I mean, Roboto, probably. Yeah, Roboto, Google Sans, those ones, yeah.
The swap option, is that by default on the Google font stuff?
No, so it's not at all on the Google Fonts.
Okay.
So since Swap won't work on Edge, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Google Fonts handles that as time goes on. But since, I mean, it's covered in like, I think it's like 72, or is I did the, can I use thing? It had like, here it is, 72.83% of browsers use it, which is really good, but that's not, it's really, that's like a promising statistic where you're like, yeah, maybe in like 4 years I'll be able to use that or something. It's really all depends on Edge, because the other ones that don't support, it's kind of interesting. Samsung Internet doesn't support it either because they tend to be like right on par with Chrome. So that, my guess has a flag in there, which I think means we're working on it or thinking about working on it, or it works behind a flag. Experimental, thank you. Yeah, so that's just any day now. Whereas Edge, we just gotta vote. Gotta get out there and vote.
Well, I could be wrong. I thought browsers, they don't understand, they'll just ignore it. Is that not?
Yeah, you can do that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but then you're pretty much saying like on this older browser, well, I guess that would only be for IE's sake, but you're basically, forsaking them to a performance pit, which is not a bad strategy if you're like 0.4% of my users use Edge. Then yeah, you can make that sacrifice. But then again, you have to worry about do 0.4% of my users use Edge because it sucks on Edge and it's really good on Chrome only. So you have to sort of weigh those pros and cons as well.
So the 100 fonts might not be that much different than one font.
Right.
Why?
So sort of that whole like FOIT thing. So like one of those fonts is going to load at a certain period of time, and you can see the way that if you use one, it'll take up to 3. I want to say up to, but on a slow connection, it will take 4 seconds to load. It's all parallelized, so you're going to have like if you have 100, it could take 4 seconds for all of them to load. And then when you do it that swap way, then it really doesn't matter. I think on one Google Fonts page, they had, that's our Google Fonts page. On one New York Times page I profiled, they had like 42 fonts. And then someone reported to on a page at like 100 and something. But it didn't matter because of the way they were loading it. Well, before I go, actually, there will be one funny story I will tell. That I'm also stealing from Zach Leatherman, who wrote a blog post about this. So one part of fonts, I should have put this in the talk, I just remembered it. So back in like before the previous 2016 election, everyone was asking like, is Mitt Romney gonna run for president? And so the news broke of whether he was gonna run or not. And I can't remember, some really big website broke this article and it said, Mitt Romney will run for president. And as we all know, that did not happen. And so everyone was all like, well, Mitt Romney's gonna run for president. All these screenshots started popping up. And they were like, no, that's not what we said. We said Mitt Romney will not run for president. And so the problem they had is they used the italic font in the header for not. So that's 2 fonts. And so the primary font loaded first, loaded Mitt Romney will run for president. And then the second one in italic said not. And so it, was sort of a funny, embarrassing snafu. So that is just another reason of why getting your web font loading is very, very important. So, yeah. Thank you all for staying here for the presentation.